So I'm realizing as I'm making more of these videos that I really need to emphasize at the opening of each video that this is not going to make a lot of sense if you don't understand the basics of the concept. So what we're talking about here is this. Each trigram represents a mind in time. That's the theory. That's the way I'm interpreting everything. Go to the first video and try to get a sense of what this language is about, because it's basically a language with 2 letters, 8 words, and 2 sentences. So here are the 2 sentences. And within each of them is a different arrangement of the 8 words. You got to understand those first before anything I'm going to say makes any sense. So having said all that disclaimer up front, let's talk about entities and enterprises. What is meant by that? Well, when I first started thinking about this stuff, I was trying to understand it. I actually was studying Tai Chi Chuan, and my master every now and then would show us mostly the prenatal arrangement. And he would describe the techniques that we were learning in Tai Chi as being related to the trigrams. And I would ask him, well, why are they related to each of the trigrams? What do the solid and broken lines mean? And I never got a satisfactory response, and that just stuck with me. And I felt like there's got to be some kind of a relationship. So when I was first thinking about this, I was thinking about, well, there's got to be some meaning to each of these things, and I was kind of stuck in the mode of thinking of them as referring to physical phenomena. So when I was looking at wind, I was thinking about, well, what does this have to do with wind? What does this have to do with water? All these things were like kind of stuck in this mode of it being a physical phenomena, and that's typically how it's talked about. But then at some point or another, it occurred to me that maybe these were metaphors for states of mind, and that's when everything kind of clicked and made sense. But since then, I've been thinking, well, you know, there's got to be some kind of a relationship to material phenomena, because there is a basic mind-matter relationship. And so, you know, there's the whole kind of school of mind over matter thought. And then there's this other, perhaps more problematic way of thinking that I find very interesting, which is called panpsychism, that just assumes that everything is mind, which I don't think can be proven, but I think that there are some good reasons to think along those lines, particularly if you just think of consciousness as being the capacity to sense and respond. Even molecules and atoms basically sense and respond. And so why would it necessarily be a mechanical agent that does the sensing and responding when we already know that there's a conscious agent that can sense and respond? Why wouldn't that be built into the fabric of all things? And so part of what I've been trying to figure out is, how do we describe physical phenomena in these terms? And I'm going to present what I would consider to be a temporary kind of partial connection. Because I'm going to talk about states of mind, but I'm going to talk about them in relation to entities, which are, of course, physical beings. Now, let's say that every entity is basically something which has a boundary condition, something which has a sense of its own self and has a sense of everything outside of that self. And one of the things that we note is that when it comes to living things, certainly, the desire for the entity to persist is probably the strongest attribute of every living entity. And so that, right off the bat, is a huge connection, because you could say that basically, and remember, this is kind of our goal position, right? The thing towards which everything is striving is to continue. And in the model, this here is the past, this here is the future. So you're taking everything that you've experienced, the body, all of like life, the sense of identity, and you're bringing it into the future. Regardless of what it takes. Which of course means that the whole thing transforms all the time. So clinging fire is a wonderful poetic term because, it may be true that fire is clinging to something, but what is it also doing? It's eating it up. So it can't cling to it. But it is. It's trying to cling to it. Just as we can't cling to life, but we do. And life is ever slipping away from us because, let's face it, no matter how long you live, life is short. In the grand scheme of things, living things come and go. We all know it. That's just the way it is. But nevertheless, we try to hold on to it for dear life because life is dear. Dear to us. And so you might say that this is the way up towards an entity persevering in that way. I'm going to use that word differently, so I shouldn't say persevering. This is the way up. The formation of an entity, you might say. And this is the disintegration of an entity. And the story is told quite clearly here. Let's say, first of all, what's required in order for an entity to exist? Well, some kind of available energy, right? We call this the current because that's what water flow is. And we know that all of life relies on water. But also, think of electrical current. Energy availability. Availability in the present, right? It's not potential stored away. It's available to us right now. So that's the first thing. That's the key. It's the root. It's what we need, energy availability. Then what do we need? Well, we need to have some sense of the past. We need to have a foundation of what came before. And then we need to have an idea of what to do, where to go, something new to do with all that stuff that happened before. So we got to have energy. We got to have some kind of a foundation, and then we have to have some sort of sense of where to go, and then we got to work on it. So wind is a very interesting concept. Why is it called gentle? Well, because this is kind of an internal work. It hasn't really yet expressed itself. It hasn't gone out on stage. There's no big debut yet. It's kind of woodshedding, you'd say in the music world. You're taking the idea you had from the past about what to do, and you're repeating it. You're doing it, you're doing it, you're doing it. And what can the wind do? Over the course of time, it can move mountains, right? It's gentle, but with perseverance. This is really, I think, a great word for wind, is perseverance. With perseverance, many things are possible that one might not think otherwise. So the other thing that's interesting to note is that when you take the foundation from the past, all the things that happened before, and you have a new idea what to do with it, and you dedicate yourself to that new idea, it's no longer a new idea. You had that new idea and it was new, but now it gets folded into the past. This line, you could say here, the past, represents both all the things that happened before and what you just figured out what you're going to do with it. And here's the testing ground where you're going to see if you can really make something of it. And if you do, badang, it shows up. It's the big debut. And entities can be really anything. It doesn't have to be one living thing. It can be a collection of living things. It can be social forms. So for instance, like civilizations, they've got to have some kind of basic energy to work with. They've got to have precedent from the past. They have to have a new idea about what to do with things, and they got to work hard before they can get out on the world stage and kick ass. And that's kind of what this is about. This is about bursting forth into the world. It's true of social organizations, intellectual movements, political movements, you name it. It's true of species, right? Every species needs to have some basic energy availability. It's got to be based upon the things that happened prior within the environment. In other words, it has to have an environmental niche, and it has to find its way to that environmental niche. It has to understand what to do in that new niche. And it's got to develop itself in order to be a competitor. Now, once you're a competitor, you're out there competing with all the other civilizations, all the other individuals, all the other species, all the other intellectual movements, and there will be victories and defeats. And at some point, you might say that as soon as there's a defeat that really hits you, there's a sense of not really knowing where you came from or where you're going. So that doesn't necessarily mean that all is lost. Because if you've really established yourself and you have a great idea of what to do with the material around you, and you've worked hard to build it, then you'll have some wins and some defeats. And so even if you start to have more defeats, there's still something to work with. You could say this is like reservoir being used up. So the reservoir is everything you've accumulated from the past, and it's sort of disappearing here. And this is the present and the future. I would say that this is kind of like dreaming, wishful thinking, turning inward, entertainments, distraction, partying. I've always used the word partying to describe Lake. It's like having a party, having fun, kind of getting a little excessive, indulgent, that sort of thing. And quite often there is a sense when these things are going on that the future is ours. Right? Entertainments tend to have that sense in them. There's a lot of show, a lot of fanfare, a lot of expenditure, a lot of waste, and yet there is this kind of like feeling of this glorious future. But really all of that fanfare is part of a passing phase. It's a decline. This is, the setting sun here in the West. And what happens at the end when the party is over is there's a kind of realization. This is the come to Jesus moment where you realize, I just can't keep doing it like this anymore. I've got to change. What does creative mean? It means you got to change. You got to change in some way in order to go around another cycle. Right? So this is the force of reality. Eternal reality. That doesn't care what we think. And it forces us to change. And when we change, we have new availability. And if we don't change, then we go the way of everything, which is that we're done. But that makes room for next thing. Right? So sometimes we're able to reinvent ourselves here, and sometimes this is literally like the spiritual experience that takes us out. Quite often, when people really are done and they just can't reinvent themselves again, that's when they find God. Right? During those last moments. So that's just the postnatal. Here's the tricky bit. How does this work in the prenatal? And in some ways, the best way to look at this, I made a special screen for this here actually. I've made the case that, and I'm not entirely sure about this, but I made the case that maybe these things progress together. That it's sort of like when you're here, this is what the individual ego thinks is going on, but this is kind of more like absolute reality. So this is what happens when the mind takes the material world as real, and this is what happens when the mind is able to transcend the material world by seeing eternity, you might say, by getting a much bigger picture and kind of able to stand back and see that things come and go and that we're part of that grand cycle. So you're sort of seeing things from a much bigger picture. So here we have our energy availability. And so we're going to try to tap into energy availability as individual ego beings. But from the point of view of, let's say, a spiritual perspective, that's just things going the way they have to go. It's like the emptiness inside us that we need to fill with more experience. And so life just goes running after whatever energy it can. It's not like it's really a choice. We feel like we're spending effort right now, running after the thing we need, right? In some ways that's describing this. But this is more like a self-preservation thing. So this is more like you have something that you want to preserve. This is way more elemental. This is just, I need food, I need water. It's like the Maslow hierarchy of needs. This is the most base level. I need energy source. And then if you're good at building something up, it's like, well, I got something built up. I want to keep it going into the future. And it's like, yeah, I need energy source for that, but that's not quite where you're thinking here. And in many respects, once you get to this point, you're kind of using up that energy source, and that's why eventually you lose the battle, right? But in reality, that pursuit of the I need energy source is just things going towards it's not really a force thing. It's more like an emptiness thing. Running towards, it's like water descends to the lowest point, right? So wherever there's a hole, wherever there's emptiness, that's where water goes. That's that relation right there. So this is the yang within water. You could say this is a conscious being inhabiting Earth. Because, without this yang line here, this would just be like Earth. So then what does this tell us? Well, here we have the foundation from the past. But of course, in this one, it's a rousing thunder. It's flipped around, right? We got the future on the inside. Right? Here, the future's on the outside. It seems like, oh yeah, it's out there. We're chasing after it. That's where the future's at, right? Here, the future's on the inside. It's all consciousness, right? Because we recognize that consciousness is eternal. And so it's just an internal manifestation of consciousness. And that's inside of us, inside of all of us. But here we are. It looks like it's the same, but it's the opposite. In this case, we think we're looking at the past. But in a certain sense, like the reality, the thing that's implied here, is that this is actually the future. So in a certain sense, you can say this is one step ahead. Because look at what happens here. Right? So you could say that we think we're looking at the past, but just the fact that we're looking at it means that we're looking towards the future. Because we're looking towards the past with the idea of utility. What are we going to do with it? That's kind of our next step. Spiritual domain's already one step ahead of it. As soon as you've made the observation about what's in the past, that's really already determining the future. And then once that future idea happens, well, now you've already lit the fire. And here you think you're working, you're persevering, right? But actually, this is the joyous part of the phase, right? You're building a future. Here you think, oh, I had an idea, I'm going to keep doing it, I'm going to keep doing it. But in reality, what you're doing is you're building a future. And then here you enter the stage, you kind of make your stand, you could say. And quite often there's not a lot of fanfare when that happens. No matter what it is you do, there's always a sense of, I'm not really sure that this was such a great thing. Maybe some people are more confident than others, but whenever you present something, there's a degree of uncertainty, you could say, as to how it's playing out. Right? But you got to believe that at least in the future, even though you brought it out into the world and the whole world was like, big deal, right? You got to believe that it's worth doing. So you keep at it. But really, once you brought it out into the world, you've already changed the world. It's like chaos theory, like the butterfly flapping its wings. As soon as something really pops out, right, it's actually making an effect. It's creating waves, whether it knows it or not. And it doesn't usually know it. So then on the way down, right, there's this struggle to maintain the thing that you've brought out into the world. And there are victories and there are losses, right? And when the losses occur, it kind of chips away at your sense of what it was you were doing and where it is that you're going. But typically this is a long process, this kind of back and forth. I mean, it depends on how long the entity lasts, right? Some things die quicker than others. So quite often you may feel like you've lost everything, but you're still persevering, right? The thing that you've established, if you've really built it up and it has good roots and it was a decent idea and you worked hard on it, then when it comes out, yeah, you're going to take some losses, but in essence, there's momentum to this thing. And so there's perseverance, right? You got your present and your past here. So you're still going to keep doing it, because what else are you going to do? You're committed to it, right? It may feel like this whole thing is empty, and you may have lost some of your confidence and sense of importance or what have you, but you're going to continue because it's the best thing you got right now, right? But you might slip into this kind of party mode thing and kind of indulge and use up some of your reserves. And that actually is just sensation. You're just in sense indulgence. There's typically this future thing because you're dreaming of this future. But you are really just kind of indulging yourself in the present. And then this is like, I got to come up with something new, right? It's you could say like after the party, you got the down the dumps and you've just got to reinvent yourself. But on some level, what this really is that previous ride is over. It's done. It's history. It's in the past, right? So whatever it was, it's done. And maybe consciousness can reinvent itself and you have a new entity and do another go around with the whole thing. But that previous cycle, whatever it was, it's done. Maybe it can be tinkered with, modified, but you're going to have to be creative and come up with something new in order for a return to occur. It's interesting. Return is something which is associated with Earth here too. So that's a pretty decent run through of what I think of as being a good kind of intermediate step. I do have one other level that I want to try to bring it to that's a little bit more about physics, and it's pretty ambitious, and I haven't really gotten it together yet. So something to look forward to. I'll keep working on it. I hope you found this interesting, and as usual, if you would like to support this or send me some feedback, criticism, whatever it is, I appreciate any and all things. Someone was very generous and sent a little bit of money, which is really helpful, because it is difficult to justify the amount of time it takes to do this. So if anyone wants to throw a few ducats my way, that will make my output more productive. Because, you do have your doubts when you put something out there. And I feel like I've gotten enough response now that I know that this is worth continuing. So I'm going to persevere. Yeah, I'll persevere here. I'm going to try to persevere here instead of persevering here. Okay, gotta go. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Adios.